Warning. You will hear things you have not heard in church. If you are easily shaken by the truth, this is not the show for you. You are watching Now You See TV. Time to wake up.
And good evening, everyone. Welcome to Now You See TV. I'm your host, Jake Grant, and tonight we have an excellent show for you. We're going to be talking about the Wars of the Giants with Gary Wayne, the author of the Genesis 6 Conspiracy, and it's going to be a great, interesting show for you guys tonight. Welcome to the show, Gary.
Well, so happy to be back, and thanks for inviting me. And yeah, really looking forward to the show tonight. I think we've got a very interesting subject lined up.
Yeah, absolutely. And before we get into the show, I have just a couple announcements to make. We just opened up registration for Now You See TV Sukkot 2018. So for those of you who are interested, you can go over to Sukkot, SUKKOT 2018.org. And this is where we're signing up for anybody who wants to come out and celebrate Sukkot with us for a week long of camping in the Southern Indiana State Park system, I think. And you can find out more information there. And of course, if you guys haven't, go over to nystv.org. We have the live show hub there. This is where the NYSTV family chat is, and where we'll be drawing some questions for later on in the show for Gary. Also, please sign up for our mailing address here, and you'll receive all updates about upcoming events. And also, for those of you who don't know, we have an events calendar on NYSTV, so you can see upcoming interviews and discussions that we're going to be having on the show. And you can see Gary Wars of the Giants right here on the calendar. And so let's get into it tonight, Gary. I'm really looking forward to this discussion. The film has always kind of interested me, and I kind of wanted you to just give us a introductory explanation of what a Nephilim is, where it comes from, and then we can kind of break into the wars that occurred later on during the flood.
Sure. So the giants show up before the flood, and that's where we first encounter the term Nephilim or Nephilim, depending on how you want to pronounce that. And it only shows up 3 times in the Old Testament in Hebrew. And you won't find it in the King James Bible. You have to take it actually back to Hebrew. So where it shows up is the first time is Genesis 6:4, which is where most people connect it to. And it is the word that you take the word giant back to from the King James Version back to Hebrew, and it will say Nephil. And it won't have the I am on there because that's the male plural of it. So you'll just see Nephil, and it goes back to Nephal, which means fallen. That's as its root word. So a lot of people confuse fallen ones as being the fallen angels being Nephilim because they connect the 2 dots there. But clearly it's the sons of God who go to the daughters of human females to produce the offspring which become the giants or the Nephilim. So it can't be one of, they can't be both, right? And we know from an Old Testament perspective, and we won't deliberate on this for very long, that the sons of God, as are depicted in Job 1:6, 1, 30, 30, what is it, 36, 37, 4-7, if I've got it right, are basically the sons of God. And these are the Ben Elohim, and you also have them, and these are the angels that are being depicted because they're presenting themselves before the throne of God. And you also have Psalm 82, where you have the council of the gods. And when you have the children of the gods, or the children of the Most High, I should say, in the Psalms, that goes back to Ben Elohim as well. So you get the understanding very quickly from an Old Testament perspective, and we could do a whole show just on this subject, but just to quickly give some validity to an Old Testament understanding that, and a literal understanding that angels, who are also, part of the host of heaven, and the morning stars, which is a circular argument of verses, all underlining that they're the same beings, different classes of beings, go to the human females, and they're likely the seraphim angels, which are the watchers. But at any rate, they produce this hybrid offspring of humans and angelic beings. And so the next time we see the word Nephilim, we see them in Numbers 13:33, and it's used twice for the descendants of Nak when they're talking about giants. And again, that will go back to the word Nephilim. And the Israelites describe themselves like grasshoppers or insects in comparison, and this comes from the spies who are sent into the land of milk and honey, the promised land, by Moses to scout out taking this land. And they come back and they tell these terrible stories about these fierce warriors and giants and the tall cities, and this is not going to be easy. They're afraid of actually taking this on, and that's one of the reasons they need to go into the desert for 40 years. And so all the other words that when you see giant in the Old Testament go back to the word Rapha or Rephaim, which is the common term used for these giants after the flood. And so when you see that the Anakim are descendants of Nephilim, and then you go to Deuteronomy 2:10-23, it'll say twice essentially that Anakim are also Rephaim. So we understand there's a direct connection between all the other uses of the word giant in the King James Version and the word Anakim and Rephaim, that they are actually connected back to Nephilim. Now, whether or not they're actually, as Numbers would say, a direct descendant of Nephilim, or they are another recreation of the same type of being after the flood, we're not really told. And for me, I prefer a second incursion over somehow surviving the flood. But Numbers 13 does leave that a little bit ambiguous, but we're not really told how they show up after the flood. I just think a second incursion fits better with Scripture. But my second position fallback would be they somehow survived the flood. So I might be a little bit wishy-washy on that, but my favorite, like I said, is there's a second incursion of fallen angels who would also be imprisoned in the abyss for the violations against creation, just as the watchers and the seraphim angels were of Genesis 6. So this is who the Nephilim are. And the Nephilim before the flood, they're going to partner with the mystical religions and the descendants of Cain and the secret societies, and they're going to corrupt the whole world, and they're going to bring about the flood. And so the flood, and in fact, this Genesis 6 story is the preamble to the flood story, because there's no separation from that in chapter 6 that goes directly into the Noah story and the flood story, and the earth is corrupt. And the whole earth is corrupted, I think, which again is basically a whole nother show in terms of what all that might mean. But understand it's more than just the violence. Like the animals are corrupted, the plants are corrupted. And I think that's why God actually calls the specific animals of the species onto the ship, because it's kind, it's not all animals. Kind is species as it's used in the Bible. That represents that species to survive into the new world after the flood, and that were probably not corrupted, even though we get both clean and unclean animals. So that's, again, a bit ambiguous, but he does select the animals that are going to survive nonetheless. And that's why they come to him, because he has in mind what he wants to do. Just as humankind is going to get a second chance to fulfill their commission as an Adamite and to start again free of this corruption. But yet also in Genesis 6, it also says that they're both before and after the flood. So we know scripturally it's sound, no matter how they get there, that Nephilim should show up after the flood. And so we get all of these names of Nephilim after the flood. I mentioned two of them, Anakim and Rephaim. But you also have Emin and Zamzuzim and Horim and Amalekim and Avim and Hivim and Horim and on and on. And then you also have, particularly with the descendants of Canaan, through Heth and Sidon, two sons, they produce all of these other peoples as opposed to sons. So you get people like the Amorites, for example, right? You know, we know the Hittites come from Heth, but we don't get all of these other ones, what, you know, where and how they come from, just the names of peoples, which is very odd because in the genealogies, they're always named as a patriarch person as the father, but this is a very, very odd statement. So I take from that one of two things. One is that they were actually sons and it hasn't been recorded accurately, which I'm not a fan of. Or secondly, that the sons of Canaan, and particularly Sidon and Heth, intermarried with the giants to create hybrid giants like the Hittites, like the Amorites, like the Jebusites, and so many of the other peoples that also populated the land of the covenant and some surrounding areas. So we have these strange people that are showing up after the flood that are considered giants, and they are also the kings and the rulers again, and they start the royal dynasties, and many of them populate the covenant land inexplicably and unaccountably right after the flood, because we know when Abraham goes from Ur to Canaan, he's going to be meeting up with at least the Hittites, right? The descendants of Heth, because he actually buys the plot for Sarah's burial at Hebron, which is Kiriath Arba, and Arba is the father of the Anak. So that's the ancient name of Hebron from the Hittites. And so all of this is just to lay a basic understanding that giants were before the flood, they also show up after the flood, and they impacted both histories.
Now, with this term Nephilim or Nephilim and the Rephaim, now, is it always translated to mean giant? Or because I know we're going to be talking about the wars of the giants tonight, but are these offspring with this altered genetics, are they always giants? Is that synonymous with the word giant? Or are there Nephilim that could be considered some other iteration of, what would be today looked at as a mythological creature?
Yeah. So always they're considered as giants. So, and I'll link where they're not in a second, which isn't specifically Nephilim or Rephaim or Anakim or any of these ones. So when you have you also have the word Rephaim used in the Old Testament after the flood as well. And that's going to go back to the Hebrew word Rapha, just as giant does, except for those three applications that I mentioned earlier where they'll go back to Nephilim. These are always giants. But where people get a little bit perhaps confused or add grayness unfairly into it, or where they shouldn't be gray on it, is that they're also known as the mighty ones or the mighty men and the men of renown. And of course, the men of renown are men of fame, and that's the word Shem. Coincidentally, it's got nothing to do with the son of Noah. It's just a name, right? But that's the word Shem that goes back to the men of fame. But the other word, the mighty ones, goes back to the word Gibor or Gibborim for, again, the male plural of that. And that's where people get confused, because people always think Gibborim might be Nephilim or Rephaim, but that's not always the case. It's used 158 times in the Old Testament, but not always to describe a giant. So you've got, like in Ruth 2:1, a description of an individual who's called, mighty, and that word goes back to Gibborim. You've got a case in the Psalms where you've got the mighty ones of God, which are Gibborim, and certainly angels aren't Gibborim. So you've got several meanings and applications where it could just mean strong or valiant or wise or a champion, not specifically a giant, which is where people, when I say they get a little bit confused sometimes, is they look at Cush, Cush's son, Nimrod, as being a giant or Nephilim, because he becomes a mighty one or a Gibborim. But that doesn't necessarily mean he's a giant, because we don't know exactly what that means, and that he's the son of Cush not the son of a fallen angel, at least from the parent side. Now, we don't know who Nimrod's mother was. Perhaps that's a Rephaim or something, and he's a hybrid giant, but that's not what really the text says. He becomes Gibborim. So we're not sure what that really means. So we can't necessarily say, for example, Nimrod is 100% a giant, but somehow he portrays or his DNA changes, but something changes with him. So not to belabor the point, but I think that's where people say, well, how do we know when a giant is a giant? Well, when it's a giant, it's going to use the word giant in the King James Version, or in other translations, it's going to say Anakim, or it's going to say Rephaim, or it's going to say Avim. And Goliath goes back to Rapha. He is a descendant of the Rephaim. So when you see Goliath the giant and some of his cohorts in the time of David and Saul, that goes back to Rapha as well. So we know there's a bloodline descendancy that goes back, and Rapha is likely the patriarchal giant that they go back to.
Yeah, the reason I asked that is because we see pre-flood a lot of the distortion of genetics through the fallen angels and the watchers interacting with animals and mankind. And some people postulate that that's where we get the modern understanding of centaurs and minotaurs and all these other creatures that seem to be tied in with this genetic manipulation. I was wondering if we see that pop up as well after the flood, or if it's exclusively the giant variety or the giant category that seems to be manifesting after the flood. Do we lose out on all these weird other creatures, or are they kind of all in the bunch?
Yeah, so let me unwind that just a little bit if I can. So the Nephilim are a specific creation, and as described in the Bible as the offspring of fallen angels and human females. And in the occult world, that produced demigods. And demigods is connected to the word heroes. And heroes in the ancient meaning were described as the offspring of the gods and human females. So Poseidon, for example, in the Greek pantheon, and or Iapetus, because they're pretty much the same god, similar, at least identical mythologies, and I would look that they're the same. They will marry either Clymene or Cloidas, depending on which mythology that you're reading, and they're going to produce 10 Titan kings of Atlantis that are recorded in Timaeus and Critias by Plato. And these are demigod heroes who are the kings and the mighty warriors. They are like Hercules. They are like Perseus. So these are mighty warriors of the ruling class. The other beings, and anywhere you go around the world, it doesn't matter whether or not you're talking about the Anunnaki. You have the heavenly Anunnaki and the earthly Anunnaki, and that's the offspring, just as you have the heavenly Titans and the earthly Titans. So I think that's also where people might confuse Nephilim as being angels as well, and perhaps they were even called Nephilim as well at one time, but we don't have anything scripturally to substantiate that. But when we look at things like the creation of the centaurs, they're created differently, or the creation of the little ones in the occult, or the creation of all of these other fabulous beings. They have a little bit different type of creation to them in the occult. We don't get a description of that in the Old Testament before the flood. But I think when we look around at the other occult versions, that this is likely was an expansion of the violations against the laws of creation. And in fact, the goddess Bast of the Egyptian pantheon is the one that's described as opening Pandora's box, and was also the queen and goddess of all sorts of bizarre sexual behavior. So she actually copulated with animals to create many of these beings from the Egyptian pantheon. So maybe it is related that way, or maybe it's DNA manipulation. Could be either, but it seems bizarre to me that these gods would want to mate with all of these other animals just to create these other beings. But maybe they poured the semen in, or what have you. But somehow they did this. And so most of these get wiped out, but seemingly we have some very odd beings show up after the flood. And not just from the occult accounts, like, let's say, King Hubada out of the Epic of Gilgamesh. That's kind of a lion-like being and a whole bunch of other strange attributes. That's the king of the cedar forest. But also in the Bible, we get like the lion men of Moab. And literally that goes back to, you know, the word Ariel, which, you know, is for lion. And in the occult, Ariel is actually a fallen angel. We don't get that name specifically in the Bible. So one wonders whether in the second impassion violation or somehow perhaps a survival, but I think again, more violations against creation. This happens after the flood, but on a much more limited basis. And I think those criminals are quickly shuffled off to the abyss.
And you mentioned the patriarch giant, Rapha. Could
Yep.
you expound a little bit more about him before we kind of go down the line and talk about some of the wars that happened between his offspring?
Yeah, we don't get anything in the Bible about Rapha as being, you know, doing any deeds or anything. Whereas we do with Arba as being, you know, father of, you know, Ahiman, Sheshai, and Talmai in Kiriath Arba. But again, we get very stingy information about Rapha or Arba, and that's all we get about Arba as being the father of the Anak or the Anakim. And so with Rapha, I think what it's telling us is that that was a giant that perhaps all of these particular branch of giants go back to. And Og is also considered Rephaim. And some people speculate that Og is the father of the Rephaim. Now again, we can't necessarily support that scripturally, but we do get 3 odd accounts of Og in the Old Testament that suggests that there's a possibility that he might be. And this is just a possibility, so that when we look at Og in Joshua 12:4 and Deuteronomy 3:11 and Joshua 13:11-13, he is called, depending on the translation that you're talking about, but for the most part, he is the remnant of the giants, or the last survivor of the Rephaim. So one presumes he's part of the original Rephaim, either before or after the flood, as being first generation after the flood on a recreation, or somehow he survives a branch of Rephaim before the flood. But the language is very, very odd. And King Og is one of the kings that is going to show up through Jewish legend right after the flood, right up and into the time of Abraham, and then into the time of the Exodus, as one of the wars that the Israelites are going to have to fight against. And he also has a brother named Sihon, who the Israelites actually fight before Og. And he's also Rephaim, and he's his brother. So again, is that before or is that after the flood? We don't know, but he could be considered possibly a patriarch. But if not, he's at least the last of the original creations of the Rephaim, and the other ones are sort of diluted second generation or hybrid Rephaim.
That's very interesting. And I know Og Bashan, of course, is the one specifically largest giant that it actually gives the measurement of for in scripture. I know they talk about how Goliath was 9 to 12 foot tall, but they give a little bit more of a specific measurement of Og. So what are we looking at for Og's size? And
so when you're looking at the ancient cubit, which is important, there's 2 cubits. There's a common cubit, which is about 18 inches, and there's a royal cubit that is just under 21 inches. Now there's a few other smaller sizes, but this is the one out of Egypt. This is the one out of most that's used in the buildings of that time. And so the question is which one do we apply first? I think you should apply the royal cubit, because these were the kings. These were the royal dynasties, and that's where the royal cubit would apply. And so we don't actually get a dimension for Og, but we do get a dimension of his bed that he's going to sleep on. And so somewhere slightly in between the beginning and the end of the bed, top or bottom, you're going to arrive at how tall he was. So what we learn from his bed is that if we take that to a royal cubit, it's getting close to 16 feet. So somewhere between 15 and 16 feet. And a common cubit would be 14 feet, and it would be about 6 feet wide or so. So you can imagine a being of probably 12 to 14 feet.
Wow.
Now, when we talk about what else it describes about that bed, this is not a wooden bed. It's an iron bed. Because the weight of wood would not, or his weight would crush a bed made of wood. So it had to be of iron. And so, and the other thing to keep in mind is about these giants is that they weren't just tall. These were muscular warriors. The average human, who probably would have been 5 to 6 feet at that time, depending on which scientist you want to talk to, and the average human has a height to width ratio of about 3 to 1. But the giants were thought to have a height to width ratio of 2 to 1. So they were like 50% wider. These were stocky monsters. So you can imagine these beings being 1,500 pounds, 2,000 pounds, smaller ones, 1,000 to 1,200 pounds, and more than twice your size. And just as Goliath, we get 6 cubits and a span from his. So that's going to be 9 feet 9 inches up to 11 feet 3 inches based on an 18 or a 21-inch cubit. So that gives you an idea of how big these monsters were. And what we don't know is how big the ones were before the flood. Mm-hmm. But what we do get is from Amos in 2:1 is that in sort of a simile that they were like the cedars of Lebanon. And the Amorites were, and these were the hybrids, and the Amorites were always considered taller. So this is more of an allegory because I don't believe they were 36 to 50 feet tall, not as a hybrid branch, and not bigger than the giants that are actually recorded because they're the hybrids. But we get the understanding of that these were pretty big people. And a lot of people think that the original giants out of Genesis 6 were actually that tall, 20 to 40 feet tall.
Now, before the Israelites kind of come out of the Exodus in Egypt, and we know about the wars that Joshua fought, were there any skirmishes or wars that were being fought between these parties as they were kind of conquering Canaan?
Before the Israelites conquered Canaan and other peoples before that?
Yeah, do we know anything
Yes.
that was happening between these giants, these Nephilim, before then?
Yeah, so we don't get anything about Nimrod, except that Nimrod is also a mighty warrior. And all of the people, as we're led to believe at this point in time, are one people under his command. So who's he warring with? Is the big question. And I think he was actually warring and capturing some Nephilim to work with him and actually had them help him build Babel. But we don't get anything biblically. That's an open-ended question, but I mean, if you're going to be a mighty warrior, you need enemies. Okay, so he took over his people rather easily. There's 3 groups of people. It's 3rd generation. There's not much to do there. So I think he earns his reputation as a mighty warrior, fighting the Nephilim and also after Babel as well. So we get an indication there. Secular history from the accounts would suggest that they're there right from the beginning of the flood, like Upnapishtim as being, or Ziusudra, which is the same individual, depending on which Mesopotamian myth of the Epic of Gilgamesh you're translating from. He was 2/3 God and 1/3 human, and he was king of Uruk before the flood. Right, and so he starts that descendancy afterwards. That eventually goes down to Gilgamesh. So I think they're there before the flood, and I think a lot of the early wars are there, but we don't get any of that scripturally. Where we do see them first show up with wars is we go to the war of 4 kings against 5. Now that comes about in Genesis 14 after Abraham has moved to Canaan. And Lot has moved into the city of Sodom, so just before the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. And so you have this Mesopotamian alliance of kings that is upset that a lot of the kingdoms of the Sodom and Gomorrah region, who were vassal kingdoms at that time, are no longer paying the tribute. And so this starts a war. And the nations that these Mesopotamian kings, alliance of four kings, fight against are all listed as Nephilim kings and kingships. So they're fighting against the Amorites in the Sodom and Gomorrah area. So they're led by Rephaim kings like Sihon and Og and those types of individuals. Those kings are all Rephaim or another form of Rephaim. You have them fighting the Emim, you have them fighting the Horim, you have them fighting the Amalekim. Every nation that is listed in Genesis 14 that they're fighting against are either hybrid Nephilim or purebred Nephilim. And you get the Amalekim in there. And Amalek doesn't show up till later as being the offspring of Eliphaz and Timnah. Right? So I think he adopts the Amalek name as the patriarch for the Amalekim, or is named that after the patriarch of the Amalekim. So these are all giant nations. And this is like the greatest battle since before the flood. And we have no idea how big some of these battles might have been before the flood. But this literally settled in that early period the whole geopolitical network, because they went right through the Middle East and right down almost to Egypt in that war, and just took out all of these giant kings and made them vassals again.
Do you have any thoughts as to where the location of these battles may have taken place? Do you think, I know there's some thoughts that it might be, around the Dead Sea area, but is there any chance that these battle zones could have been found archaeologically?
Yeah, I've not seen anything to indicate that, but I'd be shocked that they haven't been found. I'd be shocked that the Uparts wouldn't have been taken and hidden away. It just, to me, it would be, these would be massive battles. They would have massive types of weapons that would be left over, right? And arrowheads and spearheads and bones and stuff like. So I think they have been found, but we're not going to know about it until, they're ready to tell us about it. And certainly, from a Gnostic perspective, Sodom and Gomorrah were cities of light. They were cities of knowledge. There are cities where some of their versions of giants first were planted after the flood. So again, you get that Sodom narrative that's going on with these Nephilim, and you have the sexual sins going on in Sodom and Gomorrah. That also seems to apply, and that the people of Sodom wanted to have sex with these men that they somehow recognized as angels, who would either have some sort of changeling ability or they wanted to have homosexual sin. You pick your poison on that one, but they literally wanted to have sex with them. And I think this is why we get that reflection in Jude and 2 Peter and also in Luke with the days of Noah that he's talking about, this time the days of Sodom for his second coming. It's connecting these sexual violations in those particular passages.
Very interesting. And post those wars, they did have the strong presence there in Canaan, but do we see them in any other parts of Scripture named off, like in Egypt or far in Babylon, or do they kind of congregate in Canaan?
Well, no, you get a cross-pollination and a setting up of major dynasties. The Egyptian dynasty, although that initially gets settled by the descendants of Ham and Mizraim, Nimrod, who will intermarry into these other Nephilim dynasties, will, by other records, usurp the Egyptian kingship as well, with his grandson or son or great grandson, depending on which recollection that you're taking over. But you have this flood of giants that are coming down seemingly from the northwest Turkey area of Scythia after the flood and taking over. And they're going to be setting up some of these dynasties like the Mitanni dynasty, who come from also from the Aryans in secular history, or the Kassite dynasty. And they're going to intermarry with all of these people all the way through to Egypt, spreading these bloodlines. And that's how they take over the kingships, is as they invade it. The original kingships after the flood, they're started by humans, but then they're all taken over by Nephilim and or hybrid Nephilim. And so you get all of these hybrid nations being created, like the Hittites and the Hivites and the Horites and a whole bunch of other different names that, particularly that come out of the Canaan branches.
All right. So I know in the Genesis 6 conspiracy, you specifically talk about the wars of the giants that we see recorded in scripture between Joshua and the Israelites and these Nephilim, Rephaim. So let's break into that a little bit. Let's talk about what Joshua and the Israelites had to face off of when it came to these giants.
Yeah, and we talked about the spies that went into Canaan and came back and were very, very fearful. And then you have the bull incident and the calf incident. And then you have them going into the desert for 40 years because they need to have their faith forged. They need to have a military discipline forged so that they're ready to go to war with these monsters. Because it's not just the giants, it's the hybrid nations that they create, which are larger than the average Israelite. So all of them are larger. And so while they're weak and weary in the desert, they actually get their first battle 40 years before they're going to actually move into the land of the covenant. And that's with the Amalekites, or the Malachim. And as we talked about just a few minutes ago, most people just think that's the offspring of Amalek, son of Eliphaz, son of Esau. But it's a hybrid branch, no doubt about it, coming through Esau. But Amalek shows up, Amalekites show up in Genesis 14 in the War of 4 Kings against 5. So chronologically, that makes no sense. But when you understand that these people in Seir are the descendants of Seir, the descendants of Horim, because he's a Horim, and Anna is actually Hivim, or one of his descendants is a Hivim, depending on how you want to read that. You have two other races. You have Amalekim, you have Horim, and you have Hivim that the Edomites are also marrying into. So this is, again, very much a hybrid, powerful branch, and a very noble branch of giants, because you have King Agag. And in Numbers, it talks about him raising his throne, as high as heaven. Like, this is a name that is and his name is Agag. This is a name that is patriarchal and representative of a kingship like a Caesar or a Pharaoh. And then you also have another king named Agag in the time of Saul, right? Who's also a Amalekite. So this name is being passed down, and it's considered like a Caesar's title, just as Haman is an Agagite in the time of Esther, and he's going to try and wipe out the remnant of the Judeans in Persia, right? Because you have this Amalekite blood oath against the Israelites. But my point is that these weren't just human Amalekites. They were hybrids, and they were giants, and they were loaded with people that lived in amongst the same areas. Because, and as I'll touch on maybe a little bit later, you have a southern alliance of giants in that area, and right up to the Gaza area. And so that's the first battle. And the only reason why they win it, because they're not ready for this, is a little bit of help from God, which I'm sure he's helping all the way through. But in this case, we get this story of Moses raising his hands. And as long as he can hold his hands up like this, they're winning. But when he gets tired and they drop, then the Israelites start to lose. And so his aides are propping up his hands. And by the end of the day, the Israelites prevail. So there's no way they would survive this with overwhelming odds and against giants. And then after 40 years of discipline, now they're going to move sort of like this and around and not go through Gaza and the Philistines and the area of Kiryat Arba and the areas they were exploring before because of the city-states that were there and the powerful military forces. So not that these other ones that they're going to take on are going to be any easier, but for some reason they decide to go up to, they go east and then north. And I'll explain why, because they're going to get to a place of strategy that's all important in terms of how they're going to try and take the land of the covenant. So as they march north, they're going to march right into Sihon. And Sihon marches out with his Amorite army of hybrids. And again, he is Rephaim, a king of Rephaim. And Israel fights them at Jahaz or Yahav, depending on how you want to pronounce that. And Israel defeats his army and annexes all of the cities of Sihon, including Heshbon. And that's all recorded, in Deuteronomy and the book of Numbers. So his brother, King Og, who lives just a little bit further north in Ashtaroth, in Bashan, where Mount Hermon is, which is no coincidence. As I said, they purposely went back to the area where the original Nephilim were created and the area that they knew God had chosen for his own area and were waiting the nation of hope because they were going to try and wipe them from the face of the earth. That's the blood covenant that the Amalekim and all the giants had because they didn't want the Messiah to come so that the Adamites could be raised amongst angels in the future world. They're there to wipe them out and to usurp the covenants and the blessings, because in the first battle, if the Amalekim wiped them out completely, or any of these other countries wiped them out, the descendants of Esau, and in this case, they're probably thinking through Amalek and the Agag title, are going to inherit all of the covenant blessings that went through Abraham and down through Isaac and Jacob, as opposed to Esau, right? Because Jacob and Esau were brothers, and Esau was actually the older one. It's another rabbit trail. So anyways, Og comes out to fight him. He didn't think Sihon was going to have any trouble. I mean, these are pesky little insect-like humans, and he's got an army of hybrid giants and giants, but they get slaughtered. So Og comes out now on the road to Bashan and meets them at Edrei. And there, the Israelites lay another whooping on them, right? And they even slaughter Og's sons at that battle. And they take possession of all of the land, for the most part, up towards Bashan. So now they've taken all the land right up to the borders of the Ammonites, because they're not allowed to fight with the Ammonites, right? Because they had exterminated the giants from their land already. And same with some of the Edomites, not all, obviously, and same with the Moabites. And so they're also, Ammon and Moab were descendants of Lot, if people recall the chronologies out of the Bible. So then they go back down right and settled right across the river from Jericho, right across the Jordan River on the east side. But they don't cross the river yet. Moses is going to lead the armies in to fight the Midianites, because the Midianites were allied with the Amalekites, and there's Amalekites in the south and who also live amongst the Midianites. And so they defeat and slaughter 5 kings of the Midianites for all the sins that they committed while they were raiding and terrorizing the Israelites while they were still in the desert. And then they decide they're going to cross the river at Jericho, and the river dries up. So now, after all of these battles, and there's one other one that I skipped over, but it's just one other king, but now they're going to actually cross into the true hornet's nest. This is just the beginning of what they have to do. So they cross the river right at about Jericho, and this is going to be divided into basically 3 campaigns. There's a southern campaign, a northern campaign, and kind of a cleanup campaign. And then the fourth one is this ongoing battle, because they never actually quite finished what they were there to do. And I don't know whether people can see it. So when they start to attack Jericho, and that has such this great account of ritual and the taking of the promised land, and that, again, that's basically another show. That's the beginning of the southern sort of conquest. And I don't know whether people can see that or not. They probably can't. Can you see that, Jake, well enough? Or
I can.
You can? So what happens is that, and maybe I should have had better color on that, is when they call it the Southern Campaign, is they're going to go camp at a place called Gilgal. And Gilgal is close to Ai, and Ai is the key to the highways that run between the mountains all through the north and the south that the Amorites would control, and that the Israelites are going to have to control to take the conquest of, to take the promised land. And so Ai is the second city that they're going to take. And they destroy it in the same manner like Jericho. And then they go further east, not into Gaza, because they're north of Gaza, and not to the Mediterranean. And they start to swing south at about a place called Giz, and down into Ekron, into that area. And they are going to take city after city after city going through the south. And then they're going to do is they're going across like this from Jericho to Ai, and then they're going down like this, and then they're going to go back up to Gilgal again, and they're going to skip over and not take Jerusalem, where the Jebusites are, or Kiriath Arba, which is Hebron, where they're heavily infested with these giants. But they're going to swing north now into the northern campaign, and they are going to fight a large organization of armies all at once. So there's a king in the north that hears about the disaster that has happened to these powerful city-states. And, so you have city-states, like in Canaan, like you have Byblos, and you have Tyre and Jerusalem and Sidon. They were like these city-states with fortress walls, like they would have had in Greece, like a Sparta, right? And so, even the Gibeonites have 4 city-states, right, in around the area of Jericho. And that's why they meet the Gibeonites first off, and they get tricked into letting them become the temple slaves. But in the north, it's a little bit more spread out. And so there's a northern king named Jabin of Hazor, and he organizes several kings to unite into this massive army. So he sends word to King Jobab of Shimron and Asaph, and the kings, and these are multiple, the kings of Arabah in the western foothills. And you have the Canaanites in the west that he sends messages to, and the Hittites, and the Perizzites, and the Jebusites in the hill country, and the Hivites, because the Hivites also are in an area around the Syrian regions as well, of Mizpah. And they form this great alliance of armies, of an army. I can't even imagine of how many, with that many all gathered. And Joshua rushes up to meet them at the waters of Merom and absolutely slaughters them. These giant hybrid armies and giants. It's one of the greatest, not one of the greatest, it is the greatest battle ever fought in the post-Diluvian epoch. The numbers were just overwhelming, and they just laid a whooping on those hybrids like you wouldn't believe. And then afterwards, they're going to go back down to Kiriath Arba and start cleaning out some of those giants down there as well. And that's where Caleb is awarded that area. And Caleb is a Kenizzite, as people will recall, and part of the original spies. And so after that, you also have this ongoing war up north with Ephraim, because that area is still being pushed back in around the Bashan area with the Perizzites and a few other ones. And at that point in time, they stopped sort of trying to expand. And all they're doing now, until the time that Joshua dies at 110, is basically just holding on and being corrupted a little bit more and more until the time that Joshua dies. But literally, Joshua defeated 31 Nephilim kings. And that's recorded in Joshua 12:9-4. And it is the most amazing battle to try and rid these giants who laid in wait to corrupt, to do abominations in God's holy land, and to prevent the nation of hope of succeeding. That was their whole purpose. And so when you look at the context of what they're trying to do, and if the Israelites had actually fulfilled their covenant commitments that they had previously made before going into the covenant land that was made with Moses beforehand and re-established a few times, just as they re-established it with Joshua again, then you would have had all of these problems, because it was the remnant of these giants that were corrupting the Israelites that caused them to fail over time with false gods and false ways. And the problem with that is that God's will is going to be performed one way or another. It could have been done through the blessings of the covenant. Could have been maybe shorter, a lot less painful for humankind. But because they failed in their covenant obligations, that eventually to a level that God could not forgive and continue to support them, first with the northern empire and then with the southern kingdom with Judah. So Israel, Judah, you have to understand them as distinct units, especially in prophecy. They're going to be dispersed, right? They're going to be punished. And so the Messiah and the time of the Gentiles and how this fulfills right through the end time is all of the result of the curses of the covenant. That doesn't mean that Israel is obsolete, because lost Israel is going to be called again. Judah is going to mourn the one they pierced. There will be a second Exodus. It will be part of the time of Jesus when he comes. So this is not finished yet. It's just a more painful way of going on. So when people look at the wars of these Nephilim in the covenant land, it's a great part of history that isn't taught properly in churches, and the meaning isn't there.
It's really kind of sad to think about these topics not being talked about, especially when they're a biblical history account, and so fascinating at that. When you talk about this wars, they must have been massive on scale, and we even have fights between David and his mighty men against Nephilim later on down the road. So,
well, and all through the time of the judges, right? Because when you look at, and sorry to interrupt on that, but if you look at what Joshua says, I mean, they didn't even take on the Avim and some of the Hivim that were in the Gaza region. So you had like the five city state of Gaza, Ashdod, Ashkelon, Gath, and Ekron that survived, that all had Avim rulers over, that is going to produce Goliath out of Gath as being a Gittite into the time of Saul and David. And the judges, whether it's Samson, whoever, they're continually fighting these people that are supported by giants that weren't taken care of. And again, the Amalekites that David and Saul are going to try and take care of, these are still infested with giants as well: Horim, Amalekim, Hivim. And the Gibeonites were part of the Hivim branch, and they're called through the descendants of Anna, both Horim and Hivim, but I think they're a distinct branch of the Horim.
So why would Joshua and his Israelite armies get stopped? Do you think those particular locations were just inconvenient for them to attack, or they were just massive big giants? Or I mean, if they were able to face down Og and five, giant armies coming all against them of all the gathered kings, why did they stop their conquest?
They grew tired of war. This was perpetual war, and it was ongoing. And by the time Joshua dies, there isn't a will to go on and continue the fight. They do, as you read in the first few verses of Judges, there's a couple wars that are being dealt with, but a generation is growing up and they're saying, we're not doing this anymore. And so they stop with continuing what God had commanded. And of course, that just leads to ultimate destruction of the northern and southern kingdom down the road. But I think it was just perpetual war, and being humans, even though they're winning, you're still losing people, right? You're not getting out unscathed. And this constant war, I think, just wore them down.
So what would you think the percentage of completion was when it came to ridding the Holy Land of these Nephilim and Rephaim tribes that were living there in Canaan? How successful were the Israelites?
I think they were very successful in the areas that they controlled over time. So, once when you push into the areas of Bashan, as where the parasites are, and that's on the edges, I think that would be an area where they weren't that successful. As you get into the areas of Tyre and Sidon and into those locations along the sea, again, they weren't able to take all of the land of the conquest that God had promised them, right? They only took a certain portion. And certainly in Gaza and in Edom and in Seir, they didn't take those areas as well. But in the area where they lived, except for, I think, the Gibeonites, who are Hivim, and they're identified as Hivim, or Hivites, depending on which translation you're using. In Joshua, they're in the same sort of verses where this trickery is going on. They're called both. So those ones, but they're becoming temple servants. So, they're not enemies of the Israelites, and Joshua upholds the oath that he gave them. But I think within the territories, I think they had, they wiped out the giants.
So what are some other examples past the time of the Joshua conquest into the Judges and into David and the reign of the kings that we hear about giants, and what were their impact in biblical history?
So every war that you're hearing about in terms of the Judges, except for a war that would be with the Moabites or the Ammonites, are going to be against Nephilim-led civilizations and peoples. Now, it doesn't mean that the bloodlines of the kings of Moab and Ammon may have not have had Nephilim bloodlines, because they probably did to a certain degree, because they have a unique way of intermarrying and taking over the kingships over time again. But it's all the other nations that they're warring against, and typically you're hearing heavily with Hittites, you're having heavily with the Philistines, right? And so the Philistines are part of this southern alliance, and it's mostly the Philistines and the Amalekim that are the ones that David is going to fight when he becomes king, to finish the job of what the original Israelites did not do, and that's part of the kingship covenants. And so when we have the Philistines, they're part of the Avim, they're part of the Hivim, the Horim, and the Edomite alliance, and of city-states. And it's a very powerful alliance that the Judges are going up against. But when they nominate Saul as king, now the Israelites agree to basically total war to take care of these nations. If you give us this king, we'll fight and do anything that you want. And so Saul starts off, and he actually defeats King Agag of the Amalekites, of the Malakim, but he doesn't fulfill the instructions, right? And so he doesn't even kill King Agag because he actually likes the guy. He likes how well he looks and everything else, and he's going to let him survive. And Samuel actually comes along and kills King Agag. But again, obviously his bloodline survives because you have Haman the Agagite that shows up down the road. So what that spurs is that Samuel is now going to be told and instructed to appoint King David to be king after Saul dies. So this happens right after, even though David's not going to take over. And so David, when he does, after King Saul does die, he's going to be crowned, and it's at a very sort of appropriate place. He's going to be crowned king twice. First, he's going to be crowned king of the southern kingdom of Judah at Kiriath Arba, at Hebron, the capital city of the giants. And then the northern tribes are going to say, yes, we want David as king as well. And they come down and celebrate and have him crowned at Kiriath Arba as well. This is the true kingship that is being established on earth in the face of the most decadent, powerful place of the Nephilim after the flood, their capital city after the flood in the promised land. I mean, it couldn't be more stark. And so then David is going to war against the giants. And of course, he starts off early with killing Goliath, right? And in that battle at Goliath, when King Saul is still leading the Israelites and David is still a teenage boy, he picks up 5 smooth stones. And there's only one warrior out there. So why 5 smooth stones? If he's protected by God, and he was, one would probably be enough, and it was. So why 5 stones? Because you have the 5 city-states that are represented by those warriors. He thought he would have to kill all 5 kings of the Philistine alliance backed by Avim, Horim, and Amalekim. And he didn't have to. He actually, chopped off Goliath's head and chased them all the way back to Succoth, I think it was, and slaughtered them all the way there. And then after he becomes king, then he is going to finish the job that Saul wasn't able to do. And he's going to wipe the Amalekim from the face of the earth. And he is going to wipe out Gaza of the Avim. And you hear about his mighty men who also are called Gibberim, right? And the Israelites aren't Nephilim. Now you have Uriah the Hittite who might be Gibberim in terms of a Nephilim description, but I don't think David's mighty men for the most part were. And there's a couple of Gibeonites in there as well. So there's a few that could be descendants of giants or hybrid giants, but he's there to wipe out the giants that weren't wiped out before from the lands that they occupy. And by the sounds of it, he basically wipes out those nations still harboring those giants in the land that you were referring to. Did any survive? That was his job to finish, and I think that he did.
And of course, we have, after David's reign and the many battles that he fought, we do see there are giants left that have been said to be used by Solomon in the building of the temple. So were all of these giants necessarily like always bloodthirsty killing monsters, or like with these like with Solomon, were there good giants that were trying to just live amongst the Israelites at the time?
Yeah, I don't think we get scripturally where it says giants helped build the temple. We get that from some other accounts, and I don't doubt that they probably did, because the Gibeonites were temple servants, right? So why wouldn't they be helping build it? But I'm not sure, unless you know the verse, I'm not sure I know one where I can point to giants.
Not in scripture, no, not
Yeah,
at all.
but in other accounts. But when we understand who the Nephilim were, the Gibeonites, the Hivim, then I think you can very much make that connection as temple servants who were help building the temple. I also wanted to mention, though, in terms of Jerusalem, I had mentioned in the conquest of Joshua, they didn't take Jerusalem from the Jebusites, which were part of this Canaanite city-state alliance. That doesn't happen until the time of David. So again, he is finishing this mopping up. And I think it happens then because the rest of the giants are basically gone. This is going to be setting up an age of peace because the giants are wiped out from the area. So Solomon can be kind of like the priest king. They can build the temple in Jerusalem now. And I think that's another sort of part of the story that people don't quite connect.
So, Jerusalem, what is its significant, and who were the people living there before it was conquered by the Israelites?
Well, it was the Canaanites, and specifically the sect known as the Jebusites, and thought to be, again, hybrid giants. Not all of them, but, and I want to be very careful with this, because when you go back to the time of Abraham, and at the time of the battle of the giants of the War of Four Kings against five, and after Abraham uses some of his alliance partners and servants out of the Hebron area, who are probably hybrid giants, and his force to go free Lot, guess who he meets after that battle? The king of Salem. And again, I think this is not an actual Jebusite. Some people think it's Shem. I think it's an incantation of Jesus meeting with Abraham, who's going to fulfill his covenant. And I have an interesting blog on that if somebody wants a copy of that. It's too long to go into on the show because it's quite a detailed step by step, but just get a hold of me after the show. I'll send you the commentary on that. So I want to be very careful with that because of Melchizedek, who we're talking about, Melchizedek, I should say. I don't want to say he's a hybrid giant, but he's also the king of Salem, right? So that's one of the reasons why I don't think he was actually a Jebusite.
Very interesting. So after these incursions of David and his mighty men cleaning up the place, where did all the giants end up going? Where did they spread to, and where else do we see them in history?
Yeah, so the metallic dynasties that are talked about in prophecy. So you have, and I already said they have the kingship dynasties after the flood. They take them over, and I'll talk about other areas in a second. So when we talk about Babylon as the head of gold, and then you have Persia, right, and you have Greece, and you have Rome, and you have these metallic empires, as is Daniel 2. These are the descendants of these giants. And if you look at Daniel 2:43, as it gets to the end of the rising 10-toed empire of the Roman Empire, it has that basically it's saying is that the offspring or the descendants of these metallic dynasties are going to mix with the seed of humans in the end time to form this great end time army. So these royal bloodlines are still there. They're dispersed around the world now. But they're going to be part of the end time. So I just wanted to make everybody clear that when Babylon attacks, I mean, these are basically the descendants that God is using because they want to wipe out, and they still have this historical hatred for Israel. That's that blood oath that's going on. Just as Persia, Cyrus doesn't really conquer Israel. He's actually going to help Israel get their temple back. But Babylon is, and Assyria are descendants of the giants. And these are the two ones that are used. And then you have the Roman Empire that are used to disperse Judah as well. And you also have the Greece Empire. So there's this continual blood oath against Israel and Judah. Now, where do they go from out of the Middle East? Well, two locations. One is directly from the Middle East and into Europe for the most part, and also out of Scythia in several migrations, because if you recall earlier in the show, I said they came down from Scythia. So they also went up the Danube River and into Germany and into Russia, and into Sweden. And then they also went west and into England and Ireland and Scotland. And so you have these Tuatha De Danann, which are the Tuatha Danu, which are the same ones that went down to be form the Mitanni and the Kassite empires and intermixed into the covenant land. So these are the same ones. So they're branching in several different directions. And then the ones that left the Middle East, they went to meet up with other giants that were there. Now, if we look at the descendants of Japheth now, and you've got a couple interesting ones that will really highlight this. You have Gog and Magog. I believe they took names like Amalek did of Greek giants. And Gog and Magog were the offspring of Iapetus or Poseidon as giants, right? And so when we look into prophecy and we see Gog and Magog, who are going to be part of the Ezekiel 38 and 39 war in the latter time, so the end time, as opposed to again rising at the end of the 1,000-year reign to war with the descendants of Israel and those in the covenant that are grafted in. I think we see some of those being shown up in that sort of bloodline descendancy. And we also have giants in England, also named Gog and Magog and Albion as the most famous of these ones. And these are the ones that are thought to have migrated from Scythia to England and created, a race of giants there that other Trojans and Brutus and other ones also went to live amongst the well in several migrations of these people. So they've been dispersed around the world. And what's interesting is that when you see some of the science come out of the discovery of the Peruvian skulls and the DNA tracing back, they trace it back to some parts into Scotland and into Ireland, but heavily back into Scythia, which is where the secular or the polytheist forces believe that the start of the giants had started, and that the giants had two colors of hair and two colors of eyes, and were generally pale white out of this strain. And so they had red hair and hazel eyes, and blue hair, how about blue eyes and blonde hair, which were the Aryans. And so these skulls that are in North America that are found, and particularly the Peruvian ones, are the red-haired variety, which are the Tuatha De Danann and the noble Celt out of Ireland, right? And also the same type of description Dracula is based on. He's actually a noble Celt, by the way, and when you get behind the mask of their allegories. And the Aryans were the other ones, right? And they moved into the Indus Valley and north into Germany and into Russia.
Wow. Yeah, whenever we look at all these different places after the fact that seem to have giants in their lore and giants in their histories that they seem to report, like with what we see about Og and Bashan, we see the yearly parade, and they have the giants that they march around the streets. It's very interesting that they seem to hold on to that heritage, tracing back to the giants.
They do. It's part of the royal bloodlines, and you're going to see hints of it all of the time. And again, a lot of people may not know that there's a strong belief that the Aga Khan takes his bloodline back to King Og. So the great Khan of the Mongols. So, and you also have around the world some other bloodlines, right? You have, let's say in China, you have from the heavenly dragon gods of creation. You have forming the Xia dynasty and the Yellow Emperor. And they formed all of the dynasties and kingships, even though they have different names, all the way through history until communism comes along. That's the Li family. And today we have a Li back on the communist throne in China, who is a direct descendant out of the Xias and the Dragon Kings. and he has just basically made himself king forever, or president for life in China. And you have the Yamamoto dynasty that also connects back, but it connects back to the Shah dynasty. You have a couple of families in India that go back to their primordial gods and creating of the warrior class of Nephilim. You have the Khan, and you have the Singh lines there. Again, they don't hold power that we visually see today for the most part, but they're rising back. You have families that in Central and South America, when the Spanish came over, everybody thinks that the nobility that was wiped out was just the local king. And within 50 years, the Spanish had reinstated, whether it's Inca or Aztec or Quiché Maya, reinstated the nobles into their previously held status. And so those bloodlines still exist today. You know, like, so you have the Inga Roca out of the Incas, for example, and several families out of the Aztecs, and they're still in place. So, and they all take their bloodlines back to Quetzalcoatl and those feathered serpent gods and the offspring that they produced thereafter, right? So all of these giants and giant bloodlines are still in place today. Now, the size of them isn't there, and if they are, then they obviously have a changeling capability to disguise themselves. I just think, though, that their size and their looks, because originally they had a viper look to the face, kind of like Akhenaten's look. That's 2,000 years after the creation of giants. But I think it's diluted because you have to get some intermarriage with the humans to prevent blood diseases, like what, the royal families of Europe, they forgot about that. And you had, Habsburg's jaw and hemophiliac disease and a whole bunch of other blood diseases. So I think the necessity of bringing in some outside bloodlines has diluted their size and their looks over time just to prevent disease. But their bloodlines and their genealogies, they still keep.
Very fascinating. So I would like to maybe open it up for some questions right now. We've had quite a few come in. And the first one I'd like to get into, since you just finished off with talking about the bloodline, is could you speak on Rh negative blood and how it is associated? I know this is probably a show in itself, like you've said a few times tonight, but how this is associated with the Nephilim races and different tribes, and what are your thoughts there?
Yeah, so Rh negative, it does seem to have a commonality amongst Western royal families. So the English Windsors have an O negative bloodline, for example. And of course, you have the negative bloodline that is associated with all of their cousins basically around Europe. And the reason why I want to do a quick visual here, mental visual picture for people. When you look at World War I, you had the Tsars of Russia, the Caesars of Russia. You had the Kaisers and the Caesars of Germany. You have the Habsburg dynasty out of Austria. You had the King of Spain. You had the Windsor dynasties. You had the Belgium dynasties. And you had World War I break out. This was a family war because they were all cousins. That's how tightly intermarried they were. And so all of these royal dynasties of Europe were negative bloodlines for the most part. There's never a 100% rule because there's some dynasties that broke out that weren't necessarily of the Nephilim bloodline. We don't have proof that they are the blood, that is the sort of the marker of the fallen angels or the Nephilim bloodline. But one can make that connection fairly easily, that where you have the royals, you have a heavy concentration of O negative or A negative or whatever. There's 4 different types of negative bloods. And we don't know where the Rh negative comes from. It's like it's either been inserted into the bloodline of humans or vice versa, right? Because you have all the positives that were quite distinct, and at some point in time, negative shows up. And nobody's sure how or when or why. And Rh negative, until modern times, it did not mix well with positive blood. It still doesn't. So without drugs, having a baby between a negative and a positive doesn't work out very well. Generally, the Rh negative moves to kill through its antibodies the fetus. So there's not a good mix there. So there's something about Rh negative that seems to be a bit foreign, and you've got that relationship. So I do have a handout for people if they want. Get a hold of me. I got a complete Rh negative handout explaining what Rh negative is and the attributes that come along with the people of these attributes, because they have distinct attributes in terms of higher sensory perception, higher intelligence, and other things. At least that's what the science is telling us, whether or not it's propaganda or not. But if you want to get a hold of me, I can do it, or I can spend more time on it now. But we don't know for sure whether or not it is, the Nephilim bloodline. But my gut feeling is it likely is. We just don't have that smoking gun.
Yeah, maybe we should definitely do a further expansion in some kind of future interview.
Yep.
And I know some people, they always catch these interviews and they've never heard of this topic before, this concept before, and they're Rh negative, and they've heard some crazy idea. Hey, if you're Rh negative, that means you're a Nephilim offspring and
Yep.
beyond salvation. But
Yeah,
that,
because
I assure you, is not the case.
basically, if you have Rh negative blood, all that means is that you are missing a certain antigen. That's why it's negative, right? That's the difference. And also, if you have Rh negative blood, it doesn't mean that you can't be saved. I mean, being saved has nothing to do with physical attributes unless you personally violate the laws of creation doing something or sin against the Holy Spirit, right? That's the only sin that's not forgiven. But what's interesting, again, just to add a little bit more about it, is, about 85% of the world's population is positive, and only about 15% is negative. And then as you get into Northwest France and into England, you get a higher concentration of Rh negative that goes 30 to 40%. So you see this is probably a concentration in terms of how these giants moved into the areas that I was talking about earlier in the show. And then when you move into the Bezikis or the Basques, depending on how you want to pronounce that, you get as high as 80% Rh negative. And what's interesting about them is that they believe that they are a more pure blood strain than these ones that moved out from the metallic dynasties and the migrations out of the Middle East. And that they actually were the first ones to settle southwest France and northwest Spain after the flood, and they seeded and started the Egyptian dynasty, the Scythian civilization, and the Mesopotamian dynasties, according to their legends and mythologies, and they actually call themselves Homo Atlantis. So, and so you had this diaspora, this pushing out of the Basques, because they very much became elitist, and the bloodlines that came out of the Middle East that formed most of the royal dynasties in Europe, they basically said, enough of you, and we're going to basically persecute you and disperse you around the earth. So they had a major falling out amongst the bloodlines.
All right, our next question is, could the tribe of Gad have Nephilim genes? In 1 Chronicles 2:12-8, saying that they had lion-like faces. And in the verse it says, and of Gadites there were separated themselves unto David, and to the hold of the wilderness, men of might and men of war fit for the battle, and could handle shield and buckler, whose faces were like the faces of lions, and were as swift as roes upon the mountains. What are we talking about here?
Yeah, I think you are talking about lion men, and just as in Samuel, for Samuel, I think it is, or is it 2 Samuel, there is a verse where there are some lion men encountered and slaughtered by some of David's mighty men. So we get this lion-type Nephilim, I would say, and I think it probably goes back to that Ariel angel that we talked about earlier, I think, who basically means the lion of God. And I think this is an offspring from him, because these are also called Gibborim as well. in both accounts. And it goes back to the word lion. And you can say, well, it's just a metaphor, but that's not what the verse says. So I think we got one strain that is definitely Nephilim, and I think you have another one of the Gadites, because, I mean, you could read that it's not calling Gadites possibly a lion-like men, but I think it says there are lion-like men when you look at that hard. And I think just like with some of the Israelites where they married in with the Gibeonites and the Hivim, I think they might have intermarried with some of these other Nephilim type beings. And when you go back into secular history and polytheist history, you get a number of gods with lion-like traits. And you also go back into Mesopotamian history and into Egyptian history, and you get these reliefs of these lion-like men. And they were great warriors. And so I think they were recreated again after the flood to be that sort of warrior class, just as that bloodline of Singh goes back and means lion that we talked about out of India. So I think there's a strong connection, just as you got the serpent-like connection that goes back to the seraphim angels. And I think they look like they're procreators, right? So yeah, I have to say that those Gadites who were working with David, obviously, were part of those ones that were Gibberim, at least, and perhaps I don't think pureblood Nephilim, but we can't say that they're not either. And it's one of those oddities that's not explained in the Bible. And the only way you get any light on it is when you search through history. And again, if somebody wants a commentary on the lion-like men of Moab and the Gadites and how they're related to other lion-like people around the world and gods, get a hold of me after the show. I'll send you a commentary on that. Again, it's a show in itself.
Awesome. All right. So the next question was, why did Abraham bow in Genesis 23:7 to Heth? And Abraham stood up and bowed himself to the people of the land, even to the children of Heth, if these people were Nephilim.
Well, he was in a land that he's all by himself when he first goes there, right? And just his immediate wife, and Lot as a cousin, as I recall, as his relationship is, or a nephew. And so there's not very many of them, and they're in a foreign land. And I think it's not that he's worshiping them when he bows, but he is showing respect for the rulers of the land that he's going to live in, and he's going to have to live in this land of giants and Canaanites and hybrid giants. So you're going to show respect, and he also is in return shown a lot of respect. And so Abraham, obviously, as part of this 300-person commando team when he frees Lot, he's also obviously a man of strength and power and a warrior himself, and becomes quite powerful and respected in the land. So I think that's all that's going on there.
All right, our next question is, if Nephilim did not survive the flood, how many people could have possibly been on the earth by the time of the first war between these Nephilim? It's hard to imagine another way for so many armies to have grown fast.
That's a good question. I think when all of the people that were, had come down from the mountain, I think they produced in great numbers, right? But Nimrod is third generation, right? So, and Babel is built, within 100 years of the flood. So again, you get down to early on is how big could these battles be, right? But it doesn't take long as you do those multiples and how fast that, if you're being permitted by God to breed and populate, that you could create some significant numbers. So I think by the time that you get into Abraham's time, which is, hundreds of years after the flood, I mean, you're going to have a lot of people.
Mm-hmm. All right, our next question is, so when did Yah say to kill the children? Is it because they were not human during the time of the Israelite campaigns? Why did he command them to kill even the children of these nations?
Well, and in even the cattle and anything associated with them were to be slaughtered and destroyed and or burned. Total removal to cleanse the land. That if you didn't kill the children, they would grow up knowing what happened and vow vengeance and never follow. I mean, it was the way of, that's the way it was done. We don't quite understand it that way, but you know, if you were going to kill somebody's father, you would kill the son so that he doesn't grow up and kill you when you're in your older age. That's kind of how they were brought up. And so you have a twofold thing is to remove them completely from the land so that corruption can't take hold, and to prevent a resurgence of them coming back militarily within your borders to do you harm. And again, even though Israel did this to a great degree, they didn't do it to 100%. They did it to maybe 90%, and it still caused their destruction.
All right, our next question was, do you know about the work of Tom Horn and Steve Quayle and their book called Unearthing the Cloud Eaters, where it talks about in some Native American legends, cloud eaters would be equivalent to a sky dragon?
Yeah, the sky gods. So when you look at, again, I haven't read their work, any of their work. I certainly know who they are, but I have not researched any people in the genre that I talk in, because I like to come by my own research and reach my own conclusions. So it's out of no disrespect. I just didn't want to be influenced. So when we talk about North American religions, they have the same type of religion that is started in all places around the world. And so when we talk about sky dragons, let's talk about a seraphim angel. Let's talk about a feathered serpent, because these are the same, this is the same religion that is basically going into North America, that is in Central America, that goes down to South America. And when you talk about a seraphim angel, you have a seraph word that goes back to fiery serpents. This is what they looked like. They had the face of a serpent. And you put feathers on them in the physical world, and now you have a feathered serpent. These are also, which would be known as a godlike dragon, right? So when they talk about the dragon gods of China, or the dragon gods of the cloud gods of North America, we're talking about the same thing. When you talk about the Nagas out of India, again, you're talking about the same god or being. You have this commonality of the serpent-faced god all around the world, just as you have the same iconology amongst the kingships, because they look just like them in the first few generations. And when you look at the meaning of serpent in antiquity, it used to be exactly the same as a dragon in the meaning. The only reason why we look at it differently is because we have the Eden incident. And so it loses its arms and its legs, and no doubt some of them actually flew before Eden, which would be why in the fairy tales and stuff you actually have animal-like dragons. So you have these two images of God, three images of these gods for the most part. You have the seraphim viper-like gods, you have the lion-like gods, and you have the raven-like head gods, the bird gods like the Anunnaki or the Tengu. All three of them created from the gods or the fallen angels and had descendants that looked just like them. And they were the ruling and the warrior class in all cases. And I don't think that that's a coincidence. This is the seraphim class that we're talking about as the vipers are the most predominant ones, but there's obviously another class of angels that are lion-like and bird-like to give that raven-like aspect, or there's just the changeling qualities that an angel probably has. So you pick your poison on that, but it's the same story all around the world.
All right, our last question regarding this topic was, we've been talking about the giants that have lineages with the blonde-haired, blue-eyed, and the red-haired Caucasian nations, but do you know of any giant stories of giants that weren't white, or were black giants, or weren't these blonde-haired, blue-eyed, red-haired iterations, or were all giants like that?
Yeah, I think there's different strains. I think we get inundated with the ones out of the Middle East, which dominated our culture. But we do know these giants were all around the earth and in all cultures. So one would presume that not all of them were white. Now, there's an ancient book, not super ancient, and certainly not scriptural, but it's an interesting read, and it comes from the Manichaean Book of Giants, which is based on the Dead Sea Scroll Book of Giants, which is kind of this long change of the Enochian books, and just to be clear, only First Enoch seems to be scriptural. The other ones are very much polytheists. So you go second, third Enoch, Book of Giants, Manichaean Giants, and the Book of Og. Now in the Book of Og, which is part of the Manichaean Giants, it describes giants of all different forms, all different looks, and all different colors. So we can't take that as scriptural, but it is ancient saying that they had a different look. And all the different people from China or India or Japan or South America, on the original ones, except for these red-headed ones that seem to migrate over from Europe, I think, seem to have, from their legend, the same color of skins that they had for the most part, excepting some of the ones that came from an island who initially restarted the population after the flood. According to their religions and mythologies, they were white. Just as in North American ones have the white snake clan gods that resettled the northern part of North America, or of the Americas, not North America, but North America in particular, particularly as the Hopi describe and some others. But you've got names like the Danua and the Daitia and the Zura, and that come out of the subcontinent of India. So I'm thinking they probably had their skin color, but or you have the Myosi of the Chinese, and there's a few other ones there. You've got Zibelba of the Kisha Maya, and you've got the Tengu of Japan. You've got the Heroes, which were probably Aryan like that around, but all of them had different names for the same type of beings around the world. So I think there was probably different colors, I guess, is the from all the different races.
All right, and another question that was kind of wondering if you could just quickly go through how can people get in contact with some of these resources and the commentaries you've offered, such as the one you mentioned on RH Negative and your blog that you had talked about earlier?
Mm-hmm. So you can go to my website, and there's an email you can contact me there on, and on there you get a chance to look at all 98 chapters of my book. If you wanted to, it is a generous excerpt on it. So you can email me through that, or you can email me directly at garywayne@shaw.ca, and I will send it to you. You can message me on Facebook. And you can also get a hold of me through Twitter at GaryWayne63, at GaryWayne63. So if you get a hold of me in any of those ways and provide me your email number, I will send you those commentaries. I can send it to you as a blog with the Facebook link, or I can send it to you off the Word document. I just need to know which one you want.
Excellent. Thank you. And any final thoughts on these Wars of the Giants that you'd want to leave us with?
Yeah, they're not done. They're not done. As I mentioned earlier with the mighty men that are mentioned in Revelations. And again, I have a nice, interesting blog on that if somebody wants that, because not only does Daniel talk about mixing with human seed as part of the metallic dynasties of the 10 toes in Daniel 2:43, but when we get into Joel 1 and 2, for example. And you have this war that is the 200 million man war, and the same type of beings that are described in Revelation 9. It also has mighty men in there as leading these armies. And I think, and that goes back to Gibberim. And I think that's a connection. And again, not necessarily, but I think in this case, it's linking it back, because the description of these mighty men that are in the New Testament are exactly like the Gibberim of Genesis 6, except they're just not saying giants. So I think it's the descendants of these giants, or enhanced ones as we get into the end time. And then in Ezekiel 39, which is also part of Ezekiel 38 in the Gog War, you have the mighty men that's talked about in the slaughter, and that also goes back to Gibberim. And then you have Gog and Magog, who are kind of part of the name leaders, and I think that's part of those ones who come up out of the abyss in Revelation 9, who are released. The worst of the demons and the worst of the fallen angels and the impassioned ones, who are going to lead the people into the first war, which is the fake counterfeit Armageddon, so Antichrist can come in like Jesus does at Armageddon, only this is the counterfeit Armageddon, and then go after the Gog War to Jerusalem to set himself up in the temple with the abomination. And then comes the Armageddon War. And then again in Joel 3 and 4, as you move into the Armageddon War, it talks about mighty men again. And then you have these demons going out from the mouths of the false prophet and the Antichrist to lead all of the leaders of the world to Armageddon into war. I think we're going to see these Nephilim either through their demon spirits or enhanced or a recreation of them, and certainly their descendants show their force in the end time. We will not escape the days of Noah, because this is the second apocalypse and nothing is new that is under the sun. So I think we're going to have an impact of these Nephilim in the end time, somehow, some way.
Wow. And as believers, we need to have God on our side just as much as the Israelites when they were going into the land and fighting those giants then. Well, Gary, thanks for coming on and talking to us tonight about the wars of the giants and kind of tracing these Nephilim tribes throughout history. It's been very fascinating. Thank you for the discussion.
Well, thank you for having me, and hopefully I was able to put the information together in an intelligent way so that people could understand it, because, well, as you can tell, I just love talking about giants, but it's because it impacts so much of the Old Testament and prophecy. And if you don't understand Genesis 6 in the beginning, you won't understand so much of what happens in the Bible afterwards, and then what's going to happen in prophecy.
Absolutely. And you presented greatly. So yeah, I definitely had a lot to pick up from this talk. So thank you everybody for tuning in to Now You See TV. I've been your host, Jake Grant. And until next time, everybody, shalom. Good night.